see today, this is sort of your typical salt box house. It's 2 stories on one side, and then it's got this sloping roof that goes to 1 story on the north side. And it's so interesting to me as you walk up, you walk north on Main Street, all of the salt boxes, you'll see so many houses. Some of them have been altered so they don't look like salt boxes anymore, but they're all south facing. Now, on the west side of the street, there were a number of salt boxes. For example, at 135A Main Street, you'll see one that's been moved back from the street, but it always was facing to the east. And I find that so puzzling. Why weren't they all facing south? You can imagine why it was facing south. You get most of the sunlight if you have a southern facing exposure. And then if you have this roof line that's coming down on the right, all those sort of northeasters, they're not coming in at the windows, they're going toward the roof. But this is not how the structure looked originally. When it was built, originally it looked like very much a sort of Tudor style 17th century house, that the footprint was much smaller. And because we're a fairly big group, I want to bring these out for you all. So this is how this house looked originally when it was built by Josiah Hobart. About 1712, he sold it to the so-called fishhooks Mulford. That's a story in and of itself. And this is how it looks today. And there was one iteration in between, because what happens about 1720, according to our architectural historians, the west side of the house, so this part right here, the second floor is damaged. Maybe in a hurricane, maybe in a storm. Maybe it had been a fire. We don't know exactly. When it is first purchased, it looked like that first model, and you can see what happens about 1720. They have the second floor much smaller, but the footprint itself is considerably bigger. And 1750, about 30 years later, when it's owned by Matthew Mulford, David Mulford's son, or David Mulford's father, we're going to, as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about David Mulford inside. The structure is expanded for his growing family, is what we believe. But you'll be able to see inside how the building was expanded if you follow me. So come on in. So we're a little anachronistic in here. And by that I mean we have been using the house to display objects from our collection. Some of them are from the colonial era, some of them are from the early American period. So when I'm talking about the Mulford family and really focused on the 1770s, realize that not all of these objects would have been in the home of David Mulford. But so David Mulford was, as I said, this colonel in the colonial regiment, and he had 2 sons, one named David, another named Matthew, who were also in the colonial regiment. Matthew actually is documented to have gone to the Battle of Long Island in 1776 in Brooklyn. And as you may know, the battle is lost by George Washington. He flees. David Mulford, Colonel David Mulford, is on his way with his soldiers. In fact, in the midst of heading to Long Island, he is brought a copy of the Declaration of Independence in July 23rd, 1776. He bought it, or he read it to his troops when they are in Southampton. And after that, that's an amazing story to have this declaration read just less than 2 weeks after it had been signed. He gets about as far as Huntington when he discovers the battle is lost. All of the troops disperse. David Mulford comes back here to his home, and about a week later, August of 1776, after he's back, his house, and look out the window, out the door, imagine British soldiers are here. They've surrounded the house, and they are led to this house by Abraham Gardner. Abraham Gardner, if you've been to the LVIS, that's his house in 1776. He is the second, he's the second son of David Gardner, who was the lord of the manor, the owner of Gardner's Island. And Abraham Gardner I find so fascinating because he is very friendly with David Mulford. In fact, Abraham Gardner's daughter, Rachel, the namesake of the garden outside, she's a gardener, and she marries Colonel David Mulford's son, David. So there's this sort of familial relationship here, but he forces David Mulford to take the oath of allegiance to the King of England. And in 18th century sort of oath-taking, I mean, it was sort of the whole like culture of honor, very important. So the fact that he has been a leading patriot and now he is going to be swearing allegiance to the king, he decides he cannot stay here in East Hampton. So if we go through the hallway, let's go to this other room. So imagine David Mulford, he needs to leave this, he can't stay here.
Did he take the oath?
He did take the oath,
Okay.
and then fled. He was one of 171 men who fled as refugees to Connecticut. Early September, he's packing up his belongings, maybe a writing desk like this. So imagine all sort of boxes, things that he needs to pack to leave. He doesn't take his family. He has, according to the 1776 census, he has a total of 8 family members who are living here. Himself, his wife, and 6 children. He is packing up his belongings. He takes his horse. According to the list of what he was traveling with, he took 13 cattle, which I think getting on a ship with 13 cattle, I can't imagine that.
Right.
And 1 man. And we think that 1 man was an enslaved African named Jack, because about 6 months after they flee, the Connecticut Department of Public Safety permits Jack to come back from Connecticut here to East Hampton. And so it's this whole other story about, well, what role do enslaved people have here in this house? Because they said there were 8 family members listed in that 1776 census. There are also 8 enslaved people living here. So, I mean, I years and years ago, I used to work at the Tenement Museum in New York City. We talked about a lot of people fitting into a very small space. I can't imagine 16 people living in this house. So, when we have school groups and they ask about the beds, I was like, well, you have 16 people living, they would have been sleeping everywhere. So, I had mentioned earlier about the way that the house had changed. You can see the original footprint. It would have ended basically here. So this was this room, and then it would have been the room that we were just in. So the kitchen, which we'll go to in just a moment, that is that 18th century edition, circa 1720, as well as we think this probably was used as some sort of bedroom. So let's come into the kitchen and talk a little bit about the kind of work that's going on here. So the kitchen, and you'll see a couple of things, I'm sure, that you're like, what is going on here? For example, the loom. Why have a loom? Well, Colonel David Mulford's eldest son, as I said, also named David, was indentured in 1774 to become a weaver. And weaver's very important, making cloth, of course, for clothing, but also you can imagine the importance of sails here on the East End. So sailcloth is also made by weavers. And interestingly, weaving is very much a sort of, it's the whole sort of textile industry is gendered. Weaving is man's work. The spinning, and you can see, for example, there's this loom right here, spinning the thread. That is work that's done primarily by women. So that may have been one of the sisters, or maybe the mother of David Mulford. Maybe it was one of the enslaved people who was here. It's sort of a whole story that really has not been well documented, and we're only recently finding out about that they're really, who were the names of the enslaved in East Hampton. David Mulford, he's the eldest son. The second oldest child is represented by these tools. He is a cordwainer, and cordwainers are shoemakers. You may have heard of cobblers. As I've learned recently, cobblers are shoe repairers in the 18th century. So Matthew is a cordwainer. David, the eldest son, is a weaver. And to me, the question is, when their father leaves, when he flees, what happens to the farm? And you can see this, essentially a pitchfork there behind you, hayfork. Does Jack come back because he's needed on the farm? That's a question. Or what about the other 5 enslaved people that are here? Are they managing the farm for David Mulford? Is it Phoebe, David Mulford's wife? So a question that really we're trying to uncover right now. But it is a, you look at other farms around, like in Rhode Island, there's a number of instances where enslaved people basically were the foreman of the farms for the, it wasn't quite a plantation economy, but very much they were the workforce managing the farm for the white family. Any questions or?
Yep. This room was the added room.
This was added.
So where did they do the cooking before it was added?
I think probably what happened is that so there, you'll see there's the two fireplaces in each instance. That was probably where one, I believe, was probably used as a kitchen, and then the other as the parlor.
And one other question, is that installation or a bird's nest?
So yeah, if you want to come with me. Great question. Check out the seaweed in the ceiling.
Insulation.
So it's insulation, and what's terrific about it is it's not, as I understand, something that mice or rats or anything are going to want to eat. So it's very durable. So yeah, and we left that just as an example of what the construction of this house was like. In the 1940s, the Mulford family, they're trying to make a go of it, running a horseback riding business here. It's not especially successful, and so they decide that, wow, they have this building that goes back to the 17th century. The Brooklyn Museum is interested in taking pieces of it and reconstructing it in galleries there in Brooklyn on Eastern Parkway. The town gets sort of up in arms, so they say, we can't do that, we can't lose our history. So the Historical Society, which had started about almost 25 years prior, joins with the Ladies Village Improvement Society to arrange the purchase of this property. And if any of you are sort of longtime East Hampton residents, you may have gone to the LVIS fair when it was here at Mulford Farm. It was here till the 1980s, when it then eventually moved over to the LVIS property today. And that's why it was here, because they were sort of co-tenants for decades with the Historical Society. And then in the early, I think it's the early 1950s, that the property opens to the public for the first time. Any other questions? That was a great one about the way the house became part of the Historical Society. So we've seen the first floor. Now we want to go up. Oh, yep.
Is that an original bed? Did it
So
fall down like
this?
this?
Is and yes, it's I think it's dates from the early 19th century, and as you can guess, it's sort of a Murphy bed.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
The beds that we saw, a couple of beds down here, we're going to see a bunch more beds upstairs. So if you want to head upstairs, and then when you get up to the landing, go to the room on your right.
This room was added, that's why, originally. So this was probably the outside. When the house was originally built, there was some electrical, and now it's mixed up.
And we'll be going into the other rooms as well.
To face the north. 16 people. So 8 family members and 2 slaves.
So, yeah, I was mentioning there was 16 people living in this house circa 1776. We're guessing this may have been the master bedroom. We don't know for sure, but one of my predecessors thought that the lady of the house would have enjoyed her tea up here. The idea that the parlor is much more sort of again, the sort of gendered space, that for the man of the house to be welcoming guests and neighbors, and that this is sort of more of a private space. Possible, but if this is happening, kind of raises the question, who's arranging all this tea for Phoebe Mulford? Probably she's not doing it herself. And again, as I mentioned, that there's 8 enslaved people living here. Much of the work that's being done in the house, if tea is being set, in fact, certainly bringing up the water and putting it in the wash basin. This house, as we're walking around, you probably noticed, there are no sinks here. There was never any running water in the Mulford home, even into the 1940s. And in fact, East Hampton did not have a kind of municipal water system till about the turn of the 20th century. So nobody really had kind of water from the tap. You also will notice there are no light switches. There was never any electricity installed in the building, even until the 1940s. And again, there wasn't kind of electrical company here in East Hampton, again, till about the 20th century. And you'd be like, why is all this stuff added after the turn of the right around 1900? Well, remember, the railroad doesn't come to East Hampton until 1895. So in many respects, this is an isolated community for much of the 19th century. The railroad comes to Bridgehampton and Sag Harbor in 1869, 1870, but it's another 25 years for it to be arriving here in East Hampton. So this may have been the bedroom of David and Phoebe Mulford, and then later on just Phoebe, because as I said, David escapes to Connecticut. What happens to him? He never returns because of the smallpox epidemic that is ravaging the colonies during the American Revolution. He dies of smallpox in early 1778. And one of the things I'm trying to track down is his will. Because what I'm interested to find out from the will is, what did he leave to his heirs? Because if he says, oh, I leave my, pewter stein, I leave my silver, I leave
Two slaves.
Whatever it might have been, we can use that list to furnish the house to better tell the story of the Mulfords. I don't know if any of you were following in the East Hampton Star about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. There was a copy of that Declaration of Independence that I mentioned that David Mulford read to his troops. It came up for auction upstate. Mulford descendants who lived in upstate New York were putting it up for sale, and it sold for $1.5 million. My goodness, and I was in touch with the woman who purchased it. She lives in Malibu, as I understand. She's a descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration, John Witherspoon, because I thought, why on earth would you want a copy? I mean, sure, who wouldn't want a copy of the Declaration of Independence, but to spend $1.5 million. But in addition to buying the Declaration, she also spent a considerable amount of money for 80 documents related to the Mulfords. And I know that will is somewhere in here. I've been trying to get her to give us access. So if hopefully, fingers crossed, one of these days we'll be able to take a look through those 80 documents.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, the library. If anybody knows Dennis at the library, he was trying to purchase them as well, but was quickly outbid, as he says. So unfortunate. Would have been wonderful to have all of those here in our community. So let's go to the bedroom opposite of this one, and then we're going to go around, and you'll see that. Yeah. Oh, great.
So how did they get that drinking water?
It would have been a water pump. How did this get moved here?
This house probably had very strong smell.
Well, you'll notice there's a chamber. Where is that chamber pot? It's definitely in here somewhere. Yeah, I mean it's.
No water.
Yeah, I mean, not really any bathing facilities. Yeah. So, there's been a question about, so where did the enslaved people live? Were they living inside the house? Were they living like at Mount Vernon, where there were separate quarters for the enslaved? We don't know for sure, but our best guess is they're probably living under the same roof as the family. It's possible that if you peek into that space that's under the roof, and you can feel free to go through there, you'll see there's sort of another bedroom off of the separate set of stairs. So it's very possible that the domestic help that was enslaved was there because it would have provided easy access to get down to the kitchen, and then also assist with anything that was needed in these two bedrooms. It's also possible that people were sleeping in the attic. And if you want to come through here, what I want you to do is turn around, look this way, and see if you can spot the corn and the oyster shells. People come up.
Riding helmet.
Yeah.
So, if you look through here, you can see there is the corn cobs under the floorboards. Yeah, right there. there's so many mysteries in this house that we were working with the local schools to start to see if we can research more about the people who lived here and why there would have been corn cobs under the floorboards. Is it because rats brought them up or raccoons? Was it because they thought, oh, there'd be additional insulation? Or were there people living up there and then just kind of using that as sort of a trash bin? It's a good question. There's about 20 years ago, there was archaeology done in a house in Brooklyn, the Lott House, and they found under the floorboards corn cobs that had been essentially cosmograms were created, like starbursts and sort of sun designs, and they think that they were placed by the enslaved people who had lived there in the 18th century. So, I mean, keeping in mind, slavery is not really ended in New York till the 1820s. Only about 40 years before it's ended with the Civil War. So that the idea that New York does not have a history of slavery is erroneous.
Yeah, right.
It's as much involved in the slave trade as South Carolina or Georgia or places like Alabama. And when we're investigating this, I mean, it's sort of to think if enslaved people are living in the house, what was the dynamic like? I mean, that's also a big question. We're working with a historian who is investigating that because you have ideally better housing conditions than if you're in an outbuilding, but you have no privacy. You're literally, within sight of the master every hour of the day. So anyway, it's just so many great historical questions for us to continue to explore, and hope you'll keep in touch with the Historical Society and investigate it with us.
The door to outside from the kitchen.